Have you ever flown on a plane? Anybody who hasn't ever flown on a plane? Good. So we've all flown on a plane, right? Let me ask you, do you usually fly coach? I do. Usually I fly coach and I sit back, as comedian Tim Hawkins calls it, with the huddled masses. And we sit back there together all, tight and all that. And whenever I fly and sit in coach, I've noticed something. I get off the flight after a 1-hour flight, 2-hour flight. The longest I've ever flown in was 9.5 hours. And I know nothing more about flying a plane after sitting in coach than I did before I got on the plane. Does that happen to you? Anybody know more about flying the plane after just riding in coach? No. One time, because my wife was in pharmaceutical sales and flew all the time, because of her points, we got upgraded to first class. Only time I've ever flown in first class. And I could get used to that. I really could. But we flew in first class, got a little extra treatment, had a little extra room, was a little closer to the pilot and the cockpit. But I got to confess to you this morning, when I got off that flight, I didn't know how to fly a plane either. Being that close to the cockpit, I didn't really learn anything much more, but I was a little closer, still don't know how to fly a plane. When I was younger, I have an uncle who's a pilot. He is retired now, but he flies 10 hours a month and still earns more money than I do. But he flies for a corporate company now, but back in the day, he was flying little planes and invited me to go sometimes with him. And so we'd go up in all kinds of little planes. I've been up in a tail dragger, couldn't tell you exactly what the make and model of it was, but it had one little wheel on the tail and just 2 seats, and we went up in that. I've been in a 6-seater with him, that kind of thing, but small planes. And one time, as I'm sitting next to him in the co-pilot seat, which I knew nothing about co-piloting, but the whole trip he talked to me and he said, this is what I'm doing now, this is what the plane's doing, when I do this, it does this to the plane, and he explained the whole process to me about what he was doing to pilot the plane. And on this trip, it was about an hour flight. Halfway through the trip, after explaining a bunch of stuff to me, and I'd flown with him before, so he'd explained some things, he said, why don't you fly? And I've probably shared this before, but I went, say what? I'm not qualified to fly the plane. And he said, well, I'm here. Give it a try. And the interesting thing about this plane is it only had one yoke. And so he had to release some little lever, switch the yoke over to my side, which meant he had no yoke, and I truly was flying the plane with a little help from him. And what I learned is the closer in proximity you are to the pilot, the closer you are to the controls and the instruments and all of that, the more you know about how to fly a plane. I still am not a pilot. I haven't gotten my private pilot's license. I don't fly a plane. There are members of the church who do. And some may be here this morning. But I know more about flying a plane after sitting in the co-pilot seat and after actually feeling what a plane does when you push the yoke forward or pull the yoke back or turn it this way or turn it that way. And I contend to you this morning, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about Peter. Peter the disciple, Peter the apostle, and then Peter the elder. And this morning as we talk about Peter the disciple, I want to impress upon you as best I can that however close you are to the pilot determines your knowledge level and your ability level towards flying the plane. Well, the closer you are to Jesus, the more it determines your ability to be a follower of Jesus and a disciple of Jesus. And that was Peter's experience. Peter started out as a disciple. Peter started out following Jesus after the call to follow him. He left everything he knew and he followed Jesus. And for 3+ years, he was side by side pretty much with Jesus and the other disciples. Where he went, they went. Where he slept, they slept. Where they went in ministry, or he went in ministry, they went in ministry. They were together for 3+ years. And throughout the course of that time, Peter grew and learned a little more each day about following Jesus because he was close to Jesus in proximity. As a disciple or a follower of Jesus, it's super important for you and me to be in close proximity to Jesus. And so I'll ask you this morning, what's your proximity to Jesus in your faith life? How close are you? Even as close as Peter was, there were moments where he kind of pushed back and questioned Jesus and thought Jesus was going the wrong way a little bit. And that's the experience that we're looking at today to try and learn what it was like for Peter to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so if we read this whole passage in Mark 8, we'll begin to see a little bit about what it was like for Peter to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. So in Mark 8, starting at verse 31, we read this. It says, "Then he began, Jesus, to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." Jesus is teaching all of the disciples, but he's teaching in particular Peter about following him and not the religious way of going about things. Religion and the institution of religion was important to Jesus. He created it. But at the same time, it wasn't about that, because that is the very group that is going to send him to his death. And so Jesus begins teaching Peter about that, and of course the others. And he said all of that very openly to everybody. And he did it more than just this time. And he's letting them know that to follow me means you're following someone who is going to be persecuted, who's going to be tortured, who's going to be hung on a tree, dead and buried, and on the third day raised again. So Peter hears this openly with everybody, and he disagreed. And he pulls Jesus aside, one-on-one. He pulls him aside, and he begins to say this. It says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Jesus, no. How could this be? How could this happen?" And at this point, Jesus turns away from Peter back to the crowd, but he's still talking to Peter. And he wants everybody to hear what he's going to say next. It turns from a private conversation with Peter now to the rest of the disciples and everyone else who can hear. And Jesus says, but turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus begins to teach right here, right now, what it will look like to be a disciple of his. When he says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," he knows that Peter is not talking of his own accord, but that Jesus is being challenged and tested, and that at the root, it's coming from this selfish desire that comes straight from the pit of hell. And so Jesus begins to teach about those divine things. He says, he calls the crowd together with his disciples and says, basically everybody needs to hear this. And he said to them, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their lives will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. He had just told them that he was going to be beaten, tortured, arrested, accused, convicted, hung on a tree, dead and buried, and be raised again to new life on the third day. And then he says to them, if you want to sign up for my group, you've got to do the same. You've got to be willing to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. A lot of times people hear this and think that he was saying this after the cross. No, he's saying it before the cross. He knew what was coming, and they don't fully understand yet. He says, he goes on to say, that for what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Not just their life here, but eternal life. He says, indeed, what can they give in return for their life? In other words, you can't pay to have your life. You can't earn it. You don't deserve it. God gives it to you freely from His grace and His love. He says, those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when He comes in the glory of His Father and with the holy angels. When I read that this week and kept reading it over and over, I kept thinking about how Jesus knew that Peter was going to deny Him. Peter knew that in a sense he would be ashamed and or afraid of being in the same category as a follower of Jesus. And in a weak moment that Jesus knew would come, he was ashamed of Jesus and denied Him. And so Jesus has already taught Peter that if you do that, I'll be ashamed of you. And yet, did Jesus disavow Peter when He denied Him? No. He gave him a second chance because God is the God of second chances. And so this morning, what I hope you will gather from this and take away from this is that Peter the disciple is transformed by the presence of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. He confesses Jesus later as the Messiah, the one that God has sent to save the world. And so I began looking at, what was Peter's interactions? What do we have in the Gospels? What do we know about Peter? And just chronologically, if you will, in the Gospels, Peter is called to follow Jesus. And in that moment of calling to follow Jesus, and all of the call stories are a little different. 3 of them are extremely the same, and one is very different because it talks about them going out in the boat, and Jesus says, cast the net on a little deeper, go out a little deeper. And Peter says to Jesus, we've been at this all night. Like, we're professionals at this. But because you said so, I'll go out a little deeper. And then they hauled in more than they could even contain. And it says that when Jesus called him, Peter dropped everything and went. Just literally dropped everything. They left their boats, their nets, everything, and followed. Next in Scripture, you'll read that Jesus calls Peter Cephas, which was his name, an Aramaic word for rock. And he says, I will call you Peter, which is a Greek name for rock. It's not only a change in name, it's a change in his presence as a part of this mission of following Jesus. But it's also a change in, if you had the Aramaic name for rock, you might only reach those who are Aramaic or Hebrew speaking. When you change it to the Greek name, he's now going to reach Jews and Gentiles alike. He was sent out then as one of the 12 to be the disciples, go out and do Jesus' work. You'll read about in the Gospels then next to him walking on the water. When he sees Jesus walking on the water, he says, Lord, if it's you, call me to come out. And Jesus does. And for a moment there, Peter's walking on the water. And he's not only close to Jesus, but he's a little closer to understanding what it feels like to be Jesus until he gets afraid of the waves and the wind. And he begins to sink. And Jesus reaches out and grabs him and saves him. Then there's an interaction with Peter about confessing Jesus as Messiah. Peter asked them all, or Jesus, asked them all, who do they say that I am? Who do people say that I am? They give him several different answers, and then he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter speaks up and says, you're the Messiah. You're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to him, you have not learned this by any earthly manner, but this is from God. And he says, you, Peter, the rock, on this rock I will build my church. And Peter's future is given to him as a follower of Jesus. And then Jesus prays for Peter. He prays for Peter to be an example to the others. And in Acts, he actually is beginning to be that example. In the garden, he cuts off the ear of a soldier. Very impetuous, very instant, very much not a thought to it. Just, I'm going to protect Jesus. And Jesus, of course, heals the ear right then and there. And then he denied Jesus 3 times. And we talked about that a few weeks ago. He denied Jesus even knowing him, that he's not with him. And then in the resurrection account, Jesus appears to all the disciples that were there, and he pulls Peter aside, and 3 times he says, "Feed my sheep." It's just Peter and Jesus in close proximity to each other. And then, right before Pentecost, in Acts chapter 1, we read that Peter addressed all of the other disciples and said, the Scriptures had to be fulfilled, and Jesus told us that was going to happen, and he did it. And so we need to stick together. And he was that example in that moment, and then after Pentecost and on Pentecost, that Christ said he would be. He becomes that example. Peter, for 3+ years, was in extremely close proximity to Jesus. Just right there with Jesus. As a follower of Jesus, that's what helped him to grow from the call that he had placed on his life to be the disciple of Jesus leading up to Pentecost. Peter became then the Apostle Peter at Pentecost. And so this is the span that we're looking at today. And if we just narrow it down to the scripture we read this morning, there's a few things I think that Jesus was telling Peter, if you want to be my follower, being close is important, but there's a little more to it. And he says, very first off, get close. Get close. So we have to ask ourselves, what is our proximity to Jesus? How close are we to Jesus? And I would put it in terms of, are you learning anything about flying the plane? In following Jesus, am I learning anything about what it means to be a deeper, more committed follower of Jesus Christ? Or am I just okay? Like, I'm not learning anything more. I'm where I'm at. And what Jesus says is, if you want to follow me, come in, get closer, because you're going to need to learn to fly the plane. And so there was a book that was called The Practice of the Presence by Brother Lawrence, a long time ago written. And in that book, it's all about how do I stay in the presence? How do I get in the presence? How do I stay in the presence of Jesus? And the idea is I need to be close to Jesus to be able to follow Jesus. Debbie and I have been married almost 29 years now, and despite one little walk we had together where we were holding hands, and she says, you're taller than me, but why are my arms longer than yours? And I said, they're not. You're shorter than me. But apart from that, she's always walked faster than I have on any walk. And so we joke now because my mom and dad walk together, and they're 89 and almost 87, and my dad sort of leads my mom, and he walks a lot faster than her. And so we joke now that it's going to be the reverse for us. That not only does Debbie walk faster, she's 8 years younger than me, so she's going to be leading me and maybe even, pulling my walker along as I go. And she walks faster, and I've always had a hard time staying close to her. But the reality is Jesus walks faster than us. Jesus knows where we're going. Jesus has been there, but Jesus wants us to be as close as we possibly can, right next to him. And that takes intentional effort to do it. He also says to the disciples, especially Peter, you have to deny yourself. And the way you ask this in your life is your life more about you than it is about pointing people to Jesus, including you? Is it more about you and your wants and your desires and your goals and your whatever, you fill in the blank? Or is it about what does Jesus want for me to do with my life? What does Jesus want me to do in this next faithful step in following him. You have to deny yourself and understand it's not about you. It's about what Jesus has called you to. He then says, take up your cross. And what I believe he's saying in this, what I interpret this as is, what is God calling you to? What is God calling you to? God created you with a unique set of experiences, gifts, talents, abilities, and passions. And what is God calling you to? What impact are you going to have for the kingdom while you are on this earth? What is God calling you to? And that calling, that passion, that burden that you have for Jesus, you take that with you every day. You pick it up every day. And so if you're an attorney, what's God calling you to do? What impact is God calling you to make as you practice law? If you're a teacher, what is God calling you to do to make a difference in that classroom? If you are in the medical field, what is God calling you to do with your patients? Wherever you work, whatever it is you do, what is God calling you to do? What impact is God asking you to make? And you pick up that cross each and every day. When I first gave my life to Christ, even before I felt a call to vocational ministry as a pastor, I got this clear understanding in my prayer time and my reading and all of that, this clear understanding that my purpose, my cross to carry, was to help people know Jesus and grow deeper in their relationship with him. And that's over everything. And so in my marriage, what am I doing each day to help my wife know Jesus and grow deeper in her relationship? With my kids, what am I doing each day, even now that they're out of the house, to help them grow deeper in their relationship with Jesus Christ? And all the people I come in contact with, what am I doing to help them grow deeper in their relationship with Jesus Christ? Just a quick story. Debbie and I went to Longhorn Steakhouse because some members of the church gave us a gift card, and that was very generous, and we thanked them very much. But we had dinner together, and I got a bunch of gift cards at Christmas and for my birthday, and one of the folks that gave me a gift card gave me this little pouch that the gift card came in. And it actually looks like some of you won't even remember what this is, but there used to be on the inside cover of a book this little envelope that the library card went in. And it looks like it's one of those things. But I put all my gift cards in that, and I was carrying it with me, and my wife was making fun of me mercilessly. Because I, a grown man, pulled out from my pocket this little pouch of gift cards. And guess what? I wrote on it, gift cards. So there would be no mistake what it was. And so she's laughing at me, and I said to the server that night, it was a very nice young woman, I said, "Is this weird?" And then Debbie later said, "It's weird that you asked her if it was weird." But listen, all of those little interactions can help put someone at ease to receive and understand the love of Jesus. It starts a conversation, and where it goes from there is determined on your being in tune with the Holy Spirit and the leading that God is putting in your life. So take up your cross. And then the last thing Jesus says to them is, follow me. We're to follow Jesus. And I just ask you this morning, how well are you following Jesus? And you'll know if you can answer the first three questions. How close are you? Is it more about you than Jesus? And are you living your faith, picking up your cross each and every day? Because the results of following Jesus, he says, as his disciple, his follower, is you will save your life for all of eternity. It's the one thing we can do to keep our saving grace that we have in Jesus Christ assured, is to do our part and to follow Jesus. What is your proximity to Jesus? So just like you can't learn how to fly a plane sitting in coach, you can't learn to follow Jesus unless you're in very close proximity to Jesus and in his presence. And so Peter, the disciple, grew into Peter the apostle because he was in the presence of Jesus. And so I urge you this morning and this week, I urge all of us, including myself, to stay in the presence of Jesus as followers of him. And the reward will be that we will save our lives, and God willing, we'll help save the lives of others in our